The boy came home from school hungry every day, but he avoided talking about it. His father decided to find out the truth and hid a small device in his backpack. Subscribe and comment. Where are you watching us from? James had always been a meticulous and devoted father. He made sure that his son Michael had everything he needed, especially when it came to food. Every morning, before sending his son off to school, he carefully prepared a nutritious lunchbox. It was filled with sandwiches, fresh fruits, a small dessert, and a juice box, enough to keep a growing boy full and energetic throughout the school day. James prided himself on making sure his son never went hungry, knowing how important a proper meal was for a child's development. Yet something was wrong lately. James had noticed a peculiar pattern. Every evening, when Michael returned home from school, he would rush to the kitchen and eat as if he hadn't had a single bite all day. It wasn't just normal after-school hunger. This was different. Michael devoured food with the kind of desperation that made James uneasy. At first, James brushed it off as a phase. Perhaps his son was growing and needed more food, or maybe school activities were making him hungrier than usual. However, after several days of watching his son return home starving, he couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, as Michael sat at the table quickly eating a large serving of pasta, James finally voiced his concern. "Michael, are you not eating your lunch at school?" he asked casually, not wanting to sound too interrogative. Michael hesitated, his fork pausing midair for just a second before he quickly resumed eating, and mumbled, "Yeah, I eat," without looking up. James narrowed his eyes. His son wasn't a good liar, and that slight hesitation was all he needed to know that something was off. Yet Michael continued, as if to explain, "But you come home like you haven't eaten all day." Keeping his tone gentle, James asked, "Are you sure everything's okay?" Michael nodded quickly, too quickly, as if trying to end the conversation, saying, "Yeah, just I get hungry fast." I guess something in my voice wasn't right. It was as if he was trying to end the conversation as soon as possible. So James let the subject drop for the moment, though he made a mental note to investigate further. The next morning, as he packed Michael's lunchbox with the usual care, James decided to check something before handing it to his son. He made sure to take a mental snapshot of everything inside. 2 turkey sandwiches, an apple, a chocolate chip cookie, and a bottle of orange juice. He even marked the position of each item in his mind, making sure he'd recognize if anything was missing when his son returned home. Michael took the lunchbox without any complaint and hurried out the door, waving a quick goodbye as he ran toward the school bus. That evening, James was ready. As soon as his son walked through the door, he watched closely. Sure enough, Michael made a direct beeline for the kitchen, opening the fridge before even greeting his father properly. "Hey, buddy," James called, keeping his voice light. "How was school?" Michael answered with a non-committal "fine" as he pulled out some leftover chicken from the fridge and started eating. James waited a few moments before casually reaching for his son's backpack, saying, "Forgot to check your lunchbox today," as he unzipped the bag. Michael turned abruptly and said, "Dad, you don't have to," but it was too late. James had already opened the container. It was empty, completely empty. Yet something was wrong. There were no crumbs, no leftover apple core, no trace that the food had been eaten. It was as if the lunchbox had never been touched. James looked at his son and asked, "You ate all of this?" Michael swallowed hard and replied, "Yeah." James wasn't buying it. His son had always been a slow eater, and there was no way he could have finished 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a cookie without leaving a single trace. Yet here was the evidence, an empty lunchbox that shouldn't have been empty. The unease in James's chest grew deeper as he realized something was definitely wrong. He decided not to push Michael further, at least not yet, because if his son wasn't ready to talk, pressuring him wouldn't help. Instead, James resolved to find out the truth himself. That night, as Michael went to bed, James sat in the kitchen staring at the lunchbox on the counter, his mind racing through possibilities. Was his son giving his food away, losing it, throwing it out, or was someone taking it from him? The thought made James's jaw tighten. If someone was taking his son's food, then Michael was afraid to talk about it, and that fear meant it wasn't just some innocent mistake. It was something serious. James didn't know what the answer was yet, but he was determined to find out. He knew that whatever was happening with Michael's lunch wasn't normal. his son wasn't just skipping meals. His food was disappearing completely. The most logical step was to start looking for answers at school. That next morning, as Michael got ready for school, James paid close attention to his behavior. Michael seemed distant. His usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by quiet tenseness. "Have a good day, buddy," James said as he handed Michael his backpack. Michael nodded but didn't make eye contact, simply saying, "Thanks, Dad." James watched him walk out of the door and head toward the bus stop. He stood there for a moment, debating whether to drive straight to the school or wait until later in the day. Eventually, he decided to call the office and schedule a meeting with the principal later that morning. When James arrived at Michael's school, the hallways were filled with the sounds of chattering students, lockers slamming, and teachers directing kids to their classrooms. The environment was the same as it had always been, structured, safe, and familiar, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The principal, Mr. Reynolds, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a calm, professional demeanor, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Good to see you. What can I do for you?" Mr. Reynolds asked. James got straight to the point. "It's about my son, Michael. I've noticed that he comes home extremely hungry every day, even though I pack him a full lunch. He refuses to tell me what's happening, and frankly, I'm worried." Mr. Reynolds nodded, his expression turning serious. "That is concerning. Have you noticed any other changes in his behavior?" James sighed and replied, "He's more withdrawn. He avoids talking about school, and whenever I ask about his lunch, he gets nervous." The principal leaned back in his chair, considering the information. "We haven't received any reports about Michael being bullied, but that doesn't mean something isn't going on. Let me check with his teacher and see if she's noticed anything unusual." Soon, Michael's homeroom teacher, Mrs. Palmer, a kind woman who had been teaching at the school for over a decade, arrived, looking mildly surprised by the meeting. "Michael is a wonderful student," she assured James, "and I haven't noticed anything wrong, but now that you mention it, he does seem quieter than usual." James nodded and added, "I just want to make sure nothing is happening that he's afraid to talk about." They decided to pull aside a few of Michael's closest classmates, 2 boys and 1 girl who had been friends with Michael for some time, and ask them simple, non-threatening questions. In a friendly tone, Mr. Reynolds said to the group, "We just wanted to ask you a quick question about your classmate, Michael. Have you noticed anything strange about him lately?" The kids exchanged glances before one of the boys spoke up. "Michael doesn't bring lunch to school." James stiffened and asked, "What do you mean?" "I pack him lunch every morning." The girl shrugged, saying, "I don't know. I just know that he never eats with us. He either says he's not hungry or just walks away when we sit down." James felt his pulse quicken and pressed the second boy, who hesitated before saying, "Well, I think I saw him throw something away once, but I didn't really pay attention." James exchanged a glance with the principal, thinking something wasn't right. Michael wasn't just missing his lunch. He was actively hiding the fact that he had one. After the students left, James ran a hand through his hair as he tried to piece things together. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "I know for a fact that I put his lunchbox in his bag every morning. If he's not eating it, and if it's not with him, then where is it going?" Mrs. Palmer frowned and suggested, "It's possible that he's given it away or that someone is taking it." That idea made James's stomach turn. If someone is taking it, why wouldn't he tell me? He wondered. The principal exhaled slowly and said, "There could be a number of reasons. Maybe he's being pressured, or perhaps he's ashamed to admit it." James's frustration mounted. He didn't want to assume the worst, but the facts were undeniable. His son was losing his food every day, and no one seemed to know why. At that moment, Mrs. Palmer hesitated before speaking again. "There is one more thing. I don't want to make any accusations, but Michael does act nervous around one of the teachers." James's attention sharpened immediately. "Which teacher?" he asked. Mrs. Palmer bit her lip before replying, "Mr. Clark, the new math teacher." James felt his jaw tighten. "What about him?" he demanded. "I can't say for sure," she admitted, "but I've noticed that Michael seems more reserved in his class, and Mr. Clark, well, he has a different way of handling students. Some of them seem uncomfortable around him." James clenched his fists and his first instinct was to storm into Mr. Clark's classroom and demand answers. But he forced himself to stay calm. Jumping to conclusions wouldn't help Michael. Instead, he looked at the principal and said, "I want to talk to this teacher today." Mr. Reynolds nodded and arranged for a private meeting with Mr. Clark. As James left the office, his mind raced with possibilities. If a teacher was involved in whatever was happening to Michael, this was far worse than he had imagined. He was no longer just dealing with a case of missing lunches. He was dealing with someone who had power over his son. James had no intention of letting this go. He was going to get to the bottom of it one way or another. The information he had just received disturbed him deeply. Michael wasn't just skipping lunch. His food was disappearing entirely, and he was acting nervous around his math teacher, Mr. Clark. The implications were too unsettling to ignore. Even though James didn't want to jump to conclusions, everything pointed to something wrong happening between Mr. Clark and his son, and he needed to find out what it was. As he walked through the halls of the school, where students rushed past chatting and laughing, unaware of the growing tension in his mind, James knew that for them this was just another day. But for him, it was the beginning of an investigation he never wanted to be a part of. He reached the math department and stood outside Mr. Clark's classroom. The door was slightly open, and inside he could hear the teacher giving instructions to the students. James decided to wait until the lesson was over, crossed his arms, and leaned against the wall, his mind racing as he replayed every conversation he had had with Michael over the past few weeks. Michael had been distant, reserved, and unwilling to talk about school. Had he been trying to tell James something all along without actually saying the words? James felt a surge of frustration at himself for not noticing sooner. When the bell rang and students began filing out of the classroom, laughing and chatting as they made their way to their next class, some glanced curiously at James, but he ignored them. He kept his eyes on the door, waiting for Mr. Clark to emerge. When a man finally stepped out, James studied him closely. Mr. Clark was in his late 30s, tall and lean, with neatly combed blonde hair and a clean-shaven face. His expression was neutral, almost friendly, but there was something in his demeanor that immediately put James on edge. Perhaps it was the way his eyes flickered with brief surprise at the sight of James, or the slight hesitation in his step before he regained composure. At that moment, another teacher, Mr. Turner, said smoothly, "I wasn't expecting you today. How can I help you?" James forced a polite smile and replied, "I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes." Mr. Clark glanced at his watch and nodded. "Of course, let's step inside my classroom." Inside the empty room, with desks arranged in neat rows and a few math problems still written on the board, Mr. Clark gestured toward a chair, saying, "Please have a seat." James remained standing, replying, "I'd rather stand." Mr. Clark chuckled lightly and said, "Fair enough. What's on your mind?" Without wasting any time, James said, "It's about my son, Michael. He comes home hungry every day, even though I pack him a full lunch. I spoke to his classmates, and they told me they never see him eat. When I asked him about it, he got nervous and refused to explain." Mr. Clark tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, and asked, "And you believe this has something to do with me?" James studied his face. There was no immediate reaction of guilt or even a flicker of panic. In fact, Mr. Clark looked mildly amused, which made James even more suspicious, for an innocent person would have been more confused or eager to help figure out what was going on. "I don't know," James admitted, "but his homeroom teacher mentioned that he seems particularly anxious around you." Something shifted in Mr. Clark's demeanor. He clasped his hands together in front of him and nodded slightly, as if considering his words carefully. "I'm sorry to hear that. I do my best to make my classroom a comfortable space for all my students," he said, but James did not like the way he worded it. It was too careful, too rehearsed. Deciding to push a little further, James asked, "So, you haven't noticed anything unusual about Michael?" "Nothing at all." Mr. Clark smiled slightly and said, "Not that I can recall. He's a quiet student, very polite. He does his work and doesn't cause trouble. If he's been acting anxious, I can't say I've noticed." James clenched his jaw as he listened to Mr. Clark speak in a calm and unbothered tone, as if he were trying too hard to appear innocent. Though James didn't have definitive proof yet, his gut told him that this man was involved. After a brief silence, James said, "Well, I appreciate your time. If you do notice anything, I hope you'll let me know." Mr. Clark nodded and added, "Of course, I want all my students to feel safe and comfortable in my classroom." James gave a tight nod and turned to leave, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Clark had just lied to him. The teacher had been too composed, too smooth in his responses. Most teachers would at least express concern when hearing that a student was struggling, but Mr. Clark had simply deflected. Realizing that confronting Mr. Clark directly wouldn't be enough, James knew he needed evidence, proof he could not ignore. Determined, he decided to return to the principal's office. This time, he wouldn't just voice his concerns, he would demand answers. As he walked back, his mind raced with thoughts. His conversation with Mr. Clark had done nothing to ease his concerns. If anything, it had only made him more suspicious. The teacher had been too composed, too calculated, with no genuine concern in his voice, as if he had already anticipated the questions and had his answers ready. That was not the reaction of an innocent man. When James entered the principal's office, Mr. Reynolds looked up from his desk in surprise to see him again and gestured for him to sit. James, however, remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. The principal exhaled slowly, closing the folder he had been reviewing, and said, "I take it your meeting with Mr. Clark didn't go as you'd hoped?" James shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. No, it didn't. He was too smooth, too careful with his words. He didn't even seem remotely concerned when I told him about Michael's missing lunches. If he were innocent, wouldn't he have at least acted surprised? Mr. Reynolds rubbed his chin and said, "I understand your frustration, but we can't jump to conclusions without evidence. Teachers are used to dealing with difficult situations, and some develop a professional detachment. That doesn't necessarily mean they're hiding something." Leaning forward with a firm voice, James explained, "Michael never eats at school. His classmates say they've never seen him with a lunchbox. He refuses to talk about it, and he gets nervous when I ask questions. His homeroom teacher told me that he seems anxious around Mr. Clark, and when I confronted him, he gave me nothing but rehearsed answers. How much more do I need before someone takes this seriously?" The principal sighed and folded his hands together on the desk. "I believe you're genuinely concerned, and I want to help, but I have to work within the rules. Without proof that Mr. Clark is doing something wrong, I can't take disciplinary action against him. The school has strict protocols for handling accusations against staff members." James clenched his jaw, barely restraining his frustration. "So what are you saying? That you're just going to let this continue? That my son is going to keep losing his lunch, keep coming home hungry, and you're going to do nothing?" "Mr." Reynolds hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm saying that you need to be careful. If Mr. Clark really is doing something inappropriate, we need to handle it the right way. Otherwise, he'll just deny everything and nothing will change." James exhaled sharply. He wanted to argue, to demand immediate action, but he knew it would get him nowhere. The principal had already made his position clear. Unless James could provide solid evidence, the school's hands were tied. Feeling defeated, yet more determined than ever, James turned toward the door before leaving. He looked back at Mr. Reynolds and said, "If you won't do anything, I will." Mr. Reynolds sighed. "James, I understand you're upset, but please don't do anything rash." James did not answer further. He walked out of the office, his mind already forming a plan. If the school wouldn't take action, he would find another way. He was not going to sit back and watch his son suffer in silence. That night, after Michael went to bed, James sat alone in the kitchen, deep in thought. He needed a way to uncover the truth without alarming his son or tipping off Mr. Clark. Confrontation hadn't worked, and the principal wouldn't intervene without evidence. His only option was to gather undeniable proof. He picked up his phone and began researching ways to discreetly monitor interactions. It didn't take long for him to land on an idea. The next morning, before sending Michael to school, he would place a recording device inside his son's backpack. If someone was taking his food, the audio would capture it. If Mr. Clark was involved, there would finally be proof. James knew it was a risk, but at that point he had no choice. His son needed him, and he wasn't going to fail him. James woke up before dawn, his mind already set on the plan. The frustration from his conversation with the principal had not faded overnight. If anything, it had fueled his determination. He spent hours researching and planning, making sure that whatever he did next would yield concrete answers. Since the school had refused to act without proof, he would get the proof himself. Moving carefully through the quiet house, not wanting to wake Michael, James placed the small recording device, barely the size of a thumb drive and simple enough to go unnoticed, on the kitchen table. He had tested it the night before to ensure that the audio was clear, that it had enough battery to last through the school day, and that it could pick up voices from several feet away. It wasn't much, but it was the best option he had. When Michael finally came downstairs, rubbing his eyes sleepily, James greeted him with a warm smile, determined to keep things normal so that his son would not suspect anything. As usual, he packed Michael's lunch, making sure everything was neatly placed inside the container. But before zipping up the backpack, he carefully tucked the recording device into the front pocket, ensuring it wouldn't be easily noticed. Michael grabbed his bag and slung it over his shoulder, saying, "I'll see you after school, Dad." James ruffled his son's hair and watched him walk out the door, his heart pounding as all he could do was wait. The day passed agonizingly slowly. At work, James found himself unable to concentrate, constantly glancing at the clock and counting down the hours until Michael would return home. His hands itched to grab his phone and call the school, but he forced himself to stay patient. He knew that if he showed up too soon or acted hastily, he might ruin everything. He needed a full day's worth of recording, enough to capture whatever was happening without raising any suspicions. Finally, when the time came, he left work early and drove straight home, arriving just minutes before Michael's bus pulled up. From a window, he watched as his son stepped off with a face that was unreadable. As soon as Michael walked through the door, James greeted him casually. "Hey, buddy, how was school?" Michael simply shrugged and said, "Same as always," and James studied him for any sign of discomfort or change in demeanor. Although his son appeared as normal as ever, both reassuring and frustrating at the same time, James knew something was wrong. Michael had become very good at hiding his pain. After Michael went upstairs, James reached for the backpack, his hand steady as he unzipped the front pocket and pulled out the recording device. He took it into his office, closed the door, plugged it into his computer, and waited as the audio file loaded quickly. As soon as he pressed play, he heard the faint sounds of children chatting and lockers slamming. The day had officially begun. He fast-forwarded through the morning chatter, listening for anything significant. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the everyday noises of school life, teachers giving instructions, students whispering, and the occasional rustling of papers. But then, as lunchtime approached, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The faint sound of Michael unzipping his backpack, a brief pause, then another voice, one that did not belong to his son, commanding, "Give it to me." James froze. The voice was low, controlled, not angry or aggressive but firm. There was no mistaking it. "Mr. Clark." A hesitation followed by the sound of something being pulled from a bag, a faint rustling of Michael's lunchbox, then a moment of silence, and the voice spoke again, quieter this time, "You know the rules." James clenched his fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. There was no doubt now. His son's teacher had been taking his food. But why? What rules was he talking about? Then Michael's voice came next, barely above a whisper. Can I at least keep the apple?" There was another pause, then the sound of something being placed back into the bag, followed by the chilling command, "Eat it quickly and don't tell anyone." The recording continued, but James barely heard the rest as his mind spun and his body tensed with anger. Mr. Clark had been stealing his son's food. Not from another student, not due to some misunderstanding, and both the teacher and Michael had been too afraid to say anything. James had heard enough. He unplugged the device and sat back, gripping the edge of the desk to steady himself. This wasn't just about missing lunches anymore. It was about manipulation, about control, and now James had the proof he needed. He wasn't going to wait for the school to take action. He was going to put an end to this himself. For a long time, James simply stared at the computer screen, his mind racing. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it, having undeniable proof, made it all the more real. The fact that a grown man, a teacher, was taking food from a child in such a methodical way sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just bullying, it was something worse, something calculated. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't storm into the school just yet. He needed a plan, because if he acted recklessly, he might give Mr. Clark time to cover his tracks. So he pressed play again, listening closely to that final, haunting line, "Eat it quickly and don't tell anyone." A line that haunted him, for it meant Mr. Clark had done this before, likely many times. The certainty in the teacher's voice turned James's stomach as he wondered, how long has this been going on? Is Michael the only victim? His first instinct was to march upstairs and demand the full story from his son, but he stopped himself. Michael had been terrified enough to keep this a secret. If James approached him aggressively, he might shut down completely. Instead, he needed to be patient and let his son know he was safe before pressing for answers. Taking another deep breath and rubbing his temples, James finally stood up, grabbed the recording device, tucked it safely into his pocket, and walked toward the stairs. His footsteps felt heavy, and his heart pounded as he reached Michael's room. He knocked gently before pushing the door open. Michael was lying on his bed, flipping through the pages of a comic book. When he looked up and saw his father standing there, his expression immediately shifted. There was something in his eyes, fear, hesitation, that told James something was wrong. "Hey, buddy," James said softly as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Can we talk for a minute?" Michael hesitated before nodding slowly. He sat up, closed the comic book, and placed it on his lap. James sat on the edge of the bed, keeping his posture relaxed so as not to scare his son, but he needed the truth. "I know about the lunches, Michael," he said gently. "I know someone has been taking your food." Michael's entire body tensed. His fingers gripped the edges of the book, and his gaze dropped to the floor. He said nothing at first. James continued in a steady voice. "I need you to tell me the truth. Was it Mr. Clark?" A sharp intake of breath came from Michael. His shoulders hunched, and he squeezed his eyes shut for a moment before nodding. James swallowed hard. Even though he already knew the answer, hearing his son confirm it made it feel even worse. "How long has this been happening?" he asked carefully. Michael bit his lip, hesitated a while, and admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. James kept his expression neutral, even as his anger flared again, and asked, "Did he ever threaten you?" Michael shook his head quickly. "Not really. He just made it seem like I had to give it to him, like it was normal. He said it was a rule. I didn't want to get in trouble." James felt his chest tighten. "This man has manipulated you into believing that handing over your food is an obligation, something expected of you. That is worse than outright threats. It is conditioning." "Why didn't you tell me, buddy?" he asked softly. Michael hesitated again, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, and whispered, "I was scared. I thought maybe I did something wrong, and I didn't want to make it worse." Exhaling slowly and forcing himself to remain calm, James reached over and placed a comforting hand on Michael's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You did nothing wrong. This is not your fault, and I promise you, I'm going to fix it. You don't have to deal with this alone anymore." Michael finally looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty, and softly asked, "But Dad, what if you tell the school and he gets mad?" James's grip on his son's shoulder tightened slightly in reassurance. "That's not going to happen. I won't let it. You're safe, Michael." For a long moment, his son simply stared at him, searching his face for reassurance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Michael nodded. James ruffled his son's hair gently before standing up and saying, "I need to take care of something, but I want you to know that you don't have to worry about this anymore, okay?" Michael nodded again, though his expression remained uncertain. Once James stepped out of the room, his expression hardened, his jaw clenched, his fists tightened at his sides, because this wasn't just about taking food, it was about control, about power. Mr. Clark had made his son feel small and afraid, manipulated him into believing he had no choice. Now that James had his proof and Michael's confirmation, there was only one thing left to do. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for the school. His fingers hovered over the call button for a brief moment before he pressed it. The school needed to hear what he had to say, and Mr. Clark was about to face the consequences of his actions. James had always considered himself a rational man, proud of his ability to keep a level head and think through situations logically before acting. But as he sat in his car outside the school the next morning, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, he felt none of that control. He had barely slept. The recording had played over and over in his mind, each word from Mr. Clark carving deeper into his anger with its cold, calculated tone and quiet intimidation that had made Michael feel powerless. James had to stop himself from storming into the school the night before and demanding justice immediately. But he knew he had to be smart about this, for Michael's sake and to ensure Mr. Clark faced real consequences. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, and the school's front doors loomed ahead. He walked toward them with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Today, he was not just a father dropping off his child. He was a man on a mission. Inside, the hallways were alive with students, some rushing to classes, others chatting in small groups near their lockers. The atmosphere was almost deceptively peaceful, but James knew that beneath that normal exterior, somewhere in the school, a teacher had been preying on his son's vulnerability, and today that teacher was going to answer for it. He reached the front office and stepped up to the receptionist's desk. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile and asked, "Mr. Turner, good morning. Are you here to see the principal?" James replied firmly, "Yes, it's urgent." The receptionist nodded, picked up the phone, and spoke in a hushed tone before gesturing toward the door leading to the principal's office, saying, "He's expecting you." James pushed open the door and found Mr. Reynolds seated behind his desk, his expression neutral yet serious. The principal gestured for him to sit, but James remained standing and placed the recording device on the desk between them. "I have proof," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Listen to it." Mr. Reynolds hesitated, then picked up the device, plugged in a pair of earbuds, and pressed play. James watched his expression carefully. At first there was nothing. Then slowly his face darkened, his jaw tensed, and his eyes narrowed as he listened to the cold, commanding voice of Mr. Clark telling a child to hand over his lunch. James could tell the exact moment the principal realized just how serious this was. When the recording reached the part where Michael asked if he could keep the apple, and Mr. Clark responded with that chilling, "Eat it quickly and don't tell anyone." Mr. Reynolds closed his eyes for a brief second, exhaled slowly, and when the recording ended, he removed the earbuds and looked up at James. "This is unacceptable," he said in a quiet but firm voice. James snapped, "Damn right it is. My son has been suffering under that man's control, and you told me you couldn't do anything without proof. Well, there it is. What are you going to do about it?" Mr. Reynolds straightened in his chair and replied, "I'm going to handle this immediately. Mr. Clark will be called in for a meeting and disciplinary action will be taken. But, James, I need you to understand that there are procedures we have to follow." James slammed his fist down on the desk, making the principal flinch, and growled, "You're not going to tell me there's some damn red tape to go through, are you? Because I swear if you try to delay this, I will take it straight to the school board, to the media, to the police, if I have to." Mr. Reynolds held up a hand and said, "That won't be necessary. Trust me. I want this dealt with as much as you do. Give me 30 minutes. James didn't move for a moment, his body tense with the need for action, but finally he gave a sharp nod. "Fine, but I want to be there." The principal hesitated and then nodded in agreement. James left the office but didn't go far. He stood just outside with his arms crossed, waiting as the minutes ticked by. Students passed by, some throwing curious glances his way, but he ignored them. His focus was solely on seeing Mr. Clark face the consequences of what he had done. Finally, the door to the teacher's lounge opened, and Mr. Clark stepped into the hallway. Dressed sharply as always, his demeanor relaxed as he walked toward the office, but the moment he saw James standing there, his face changed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise, of unease, and James caught it clearly, thinking, "Good, you should be scared." Mr. Clark stepped inside, and James followed close behind. Mr. Reynolds was already seated, his hands folded on the desk, and gestured for both men to sit, But James remained standing, his glare fixed on Mr. Clark. The teacher offered a polite smile and asked, "What's this about, Principal Reynolds?" Without wasting any time, Mr. Reynolds said, "Mr. Clark, a serious accusation has been made against you, and I have a recording as evidence. I would like you to listen to it before you respond for the first time." Mr. Clark's confidence wavered. His fingers twitched slightly as he reached for the earbuds. He placed them in his ears, and as soon as the recording started playing, James watched his reaction closely. At first, his expression remained neutral, but as the words played out, his jaw tightened and his eyes flickered with a mix of calculation and realization that he had been caught. When the recording ended, Mr. Clark removed the earbuds and carefully placed them back on the desk. In a composed voice, he said smoothly, "This is being taken out of context." James saw red and growled. "Out of context? You took my son's lunch. You made him believe it was a rule. You manipulated him into staying silent. How many others? How long have you been doing this?" Mr. Clark's lips parted, but no words came out. He was cornered and knew it. Mr. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice cold. "Mr. Clark, this school has zero tolerance for this kind of behavior. You are hereby suspended pending a full investigation. If further misconduct is found, you will be permanently dismissed and reported to the authorities." Mr. Clark opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, but then closed it again. He was defeated. James exhaled, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. It was a step in the right direction. His son would no longer have to suffer under this man's control. As Mr. Clark was escorted out of the office, James turned back to Mr. Reynolds and said firmly, "Make sure he never steps foot in this school again." Mr. Reynolds nodded. "That is my intention." James walked out feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He had done what he needed to do, and now it was time to help his son heal. The sun was just beginning to rise when James stepped outside onto the porch with a cup of coffee in his hands. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp grass and the distant hum of morning traffic. It was a new day, and more importantly, it was the first day in a long time that he felt like he could breathe again. Soon after, a message arrived on his phone. "Just wanted to let you know that Mr. Clark officially resigned this morning. He won't be coming back, and we're also implementing stricter teacher oversight to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." James let out a slow breath, reading the message twice before setting his phone down. It was over, really over. That night, as they sat at the dinner table, Michael ate without hesitation for days. He had been pushing his food around his plate, eating just enough to avoid questions, but that night was different. He ate like a kid who wasn't afraid of going hungry. The next day after dinner, James sat on the couch flipping through a book when he felt a small presence settle next to him. He glanced down to see Michael leaning against his side. "Hey, buddy," James said, closing the book. "Everything okay?" Michael hesitated before nodding. "Yeah." And after another brief pause, he added, "Thanks, Dad." James smiled and wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders as the night stretched on, peaceful and calm. It was a new day, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next video, and feel free to share this video with others, and check out more stories on our channel.